Welcome to the podcast Scattered, one person's search for the story behind scattered remains. My name is Yvonne Chorlin. I'm a physical anthropologist and archaeologist. In other words, I like dead people. In this podcast, I speak about searching for and the discovery and recovery of dispersed remains from outdoor contexts. I offer new perspectives and insights directly from the mouths of researchers, as well as experiences of people who work with remains. All of this aims to provide you with valuable information on a subject that isn't talked about, doesn't seem to be a priority, and that is very understudied. I hope you enjoy. Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 12 of Scattered. Just a few notes before we start today's episode. The first you may have noticed is the music. We're changing things up a little bit. I hope you like it. I wanted to let you know that I have a few videos up of our research site. So if you are unaware, I've been doing some research, helping out with Dr. Sherry Forbes's research project across Canada. And we have some videos on some preliminary results of that research in Alberta. So please feel free to check it out at my website at yvonnechorlin.com/anthropology/podcasts. Scroll down and you'll find the videos there. And then a note to listeners that this episode is a little bit different than what you've been exposed to so far. My discussion with Nick involves some difficult topics around mass graves, wars, conflict, and damaged or incomplete human remains. These are not easy topics to talk about or even to listen to. So I wanted to just bring your attention that, you know what, this may not be the episode for you, but we do try to talk about these topics with sensitivity and awareness. So with that in mind, here is the episode. All right, so Nick, I'm going to get you to introduce yourself just to make sure that we get this right. I don't want to mess it up. So take it away, Nick.
Hi, Yvonne. So my name is Dr. Nicholas Marquez-Grant, or Nick. And I'm a forensic anthropologist working in the UK. And I'm also senior lecturer in forensic anthropology at Cranfield University in England.
And where in England is Cranfield?
So there's two different campuses. One is an hour more or less from north of London. And we've got a part of Cranfield that we're in a military base, which is a few hours to the west of London. But yes, not far from London. So if you are come and visit us, we're not far away.
Nice. All right. Well, the reason I wanted to reach out to you is because I've been trying to find some way to include some awareness of the next of kin, because working with scattered or scavenged remains, there's always this intent to increase the amount of remains that are recovered so you can get a higher possibility that you would get a positive ID on the deceased and return as many remains as possible to the next of kin. But for forensics, because of the time involved, whether it's a few weeks, months, years, that is very close emotionally from the decedent, whether they died of exposure or they were murdered or they're missing, and talking to the family sticks to the next of kin, and that's just a very emotionally intense subject. So I thought, talking to somebody like you, because you work a lot with World War I and World War II remains, that's a little bit further distance, and I thought maybe you can add something to the conversation. Do you deal with next of kin when you're working with World War I and World War II remains?
So I think the first thing to say is that forensic anthropologists nowadays work in a number of scenarios. They work in mass disasters, say wildfires or transportation accidents. There are also forensic anthropologists working on historical remains. For example, First World War, Second World War, In my case, I work a lot in identifying those that were executed in the 1930s and 1940s in Spain, um, mainly from the Spanish Civil War and the dictatorship that followed. So apart from the historical and the disasters, we also have forensic anthropologists that are really working in humanitarian missions. So if you think about Latin America, there are big teams in Argentina, in Guatemala, in Chile. There's a big humanitarian crisis in Mexico. And a lot of the conflicts that we've had in recent years. And then there are forensic anthropologists that would work in domestic cases. So, homicide, natural deaths, accidental deaths, and so on. Fresh or flesh, they may be skeletonized or burnt. And this family liaison officer is appointed in the UK for any relative that is missing a loved one. So in terms of a missing persons case, or say a homicide, or just a fatality. Now, I see this role happening in human rights investigations, and it's actually the anthropologist, but a forensic anthropologist that also has a social and cultural background. So you think of the human rights investigations happening in Latin America, it's the forensic anthropologists that have also that social or cultural background, or the social anthropologists that are really liaising with the families. There may be some issues about whether they want to liaise with the military or the police, and sometimes the social anthropologists or forensic anthropologists are the ones that really can talk to those families to obtain that information. The information that they want is perhaps a photograph of their loved one. It's information about their age at death, their height, any diseases that they may find, and anything around the dates that were missing. And I think it's very important now that apart from obtaining that information, and also if the remains are found, that the social forensic anthropologist or physical anthropologist manages those family expectations. And I think that's one of the things that I've come across. I've come across, traveling abroad, mothers of the missing in human rights investigations saying, well, it's fine because DNA will do everything. And I think it's important to manage those family expectations and explain to them that not every single person will be identified. And I'm referring to a mass grave from a conflict. Also say that even if we have a DNA profile from the deceased, it's sometimes we don't have that DNA reference sample to be able to compare, identify. An example would be my grandmother passed away last year, and her father, so my great-grandfather, he was executed in 1936 in Spain, and his body has never been found. And it's frustrating in a way that my DNA sample will not necessarily help identify that person just because of the different genealogy trees and different ways that DNA testing tends to occur. But one of the things I'm really keen to know is trying to manage family expectations, to sort of understand how identification works, why sometimes we take so long to excavate a mass grave, and the different ways that I see that happening at the moment. One is to provide workshops, and there are a number of anthropologists, forensic anthropologists that have done workshops for families to be able to say, look, this is how DNA works, this is how identification occurs, this is where, identification is not possible. Last year, when we were digging a mass grave from the Spanish Civil War, we were looking for 26 people that were executed just after the Civil War, just after the end of the war in 1939, and also 1940s. There was still a political party that were executing. And we know we're going to get many questions. And what we did, we provided a poster with all these questions that they wanted perhaps answered, and they could obviously access that if they had a phone, through a QR. And it's things like, what are we doing here? How are we treating the remains in an ethical manner? How will DNA work, and things like that. So that's one of the things that we feel is necessary. In many human rights investigations, it's actually the families or the family associations that request that forensic anthropologists help them in the search for their missing. So there's a conversation happening there. And Yvonne, you can ask me about other things later on. I'm just jumping a little bit more. In more homicide cases or missing person cases in the UK, I've not expected to deal with the relatives or the next of kin. As said, the police have an officer, a family liaison officer, but sometimes this is unavoidable. I've had cases where the families have actually come to visit the scene. I remember this occurred in a scatter scene, and the questions were, how was my loved one lying on the area of woodland? Are there any bones missing? I was doing a search for a missing person abroad, and the mother of missing child came by to say thank you for the work we were doing. So you do actually end up meeting next of kin sometimes when you're not expecting it or you're not even prepared for this.
Yeah, I understand that. I worked on an investigation in Vancouver, and I was quite thankful that I joined the investigation a little bit later than the rest of my colleagues, because at the very beginning, there were a lot of family members at the scene. And in a very, I guess, stereotypical fashion, I deal better with the dead than I do with the living. So I was very thankful that I missed that. But yeah, it can be, I can understand that it can be an interesting experience to have the next of kin and family members at the scene. And how do you work with that and the emotions involved?
Absolutely. So an example is a search for 26 people that were executed 1939, 1940 in Spain, and we did this excavation in May 2021. And I've worked on First World War sites or battlefields and Second World War, sea transport air crashes. And it's interesting that in these cases of the First Second World War, the public are away from the scene. There's a cordon. You're not allowed to see the remains, not allowed to sort of screened from public viewing, let's say. In the case of some of the civil wars that we're finding in Latin America, and in the case in Spain, you've got the families around the mass grave as you're digging. And we returned the remains of the 26 that we excavated in May 2021 earlier this year. And of course, some of the next of kin never met the person that was executed. They hadn't been born. The children that are still alive, I remember one person telling me that she was probably 2 months old and she couldn't remember her father, but of course through images and photographs, obviously she was searching for her father. And this was interesting for me because I just became a dad and my son was 2 months old, and I was thinking, so okay, if I disappear now, my son will not remember me, and it sort of stuck with me. But what happens is that there's no public screening, and I wasn't sure about the ethics of that. But what I realized, according to some of the colleagues I've worked with, is that the skeletons are sometimes the only evidence of what happened. These sort of stories are not in books, maybe now a bit more, not taught in history. And sometimes, you need to see this so things don't happen again. And having the next of kin around, I remember a family of 50 family members came to receive the human remains of their loved one. It's basically, as I said, someone that was shot in 1939. The son was still alive in his 90s, and the whole family came. The great-great-grandchildren and everything. The only problem with that case is that we could not confirm with DNA whether that was the person or not. So the remains, they came from far away, several hours travel, 50 of them, and they had to leave the remains at a cemetery, still in a common grave, but dignified, until we can get further tests done and so on. So it's really hard, to try and identify someone when you can't identify someone, and managing these family expectations is very important from the very start. This goes back to disasters and DNA. If you think of, not really nice to think about now, but I don't know, train crash or an airplane crash or a fatal fire, it's important to speak to families in terms of, if you find a human bone fragment and we identify that fragment through DNA as someone, will they want to know what happens to the other part of the skeleton that's missing? Sometimes we can only identify, as you know, in many cases, I want to mention certain specific ones, but sometimes in some disasters, only one bone fragment is what we have of one person. Just how do you manage that? And how do you, in terms of your enclosure, about coffin's going to be, it's going to have one fragment. So I think that conversation is really important at the very beginning.
Yeah. So I'd like to touch on two things. One, if we could delve into a little bit the DNA and why it's not, the end all and be all. But first, there's, that the issue of, I don't want to say the issue, but the reality of families and the next of kin. I mean, there's not just that they want answers, but there's also cultures, religions, groups that is not just about wanting answers. They need to have their ceremony or their mortuary rituals or whatever with the remains, with the dead, whether it's to touch the remains, whether it's to do whatever ritual, their ceremony, so that they have that kind of closure too. So it's not just about the answers, answering the questions of what happened. Is this, my loved one, my family member, and, how much are we getting back of the remains? But it's also, I think, the emotional closure that those types of ceremony can have, and what that type of ceremony can involve, whether it's the physical touching and all of that. So I think there's a lot more going on with that sort of closure rather than just answering questions that is involved.
That's right. Absolutely. I think someone that knows a little bit more about the social and cultural background of the next of kin and the families or the society that has lost a lot of people is really important. Whether that is a social anthropologist or cultural anthropologist, I think it's really important. There's been a number of cases that my colleagues have worked where some of the relatives did not want the body returned to them. The reason is that it had passed the cleansing ritual or rites. So the days, so obviously the body hadn't been purified and so on, and they didn't want that back. So I think understanding these sort of social, cultural, don't what you call them, traits, characteristics, sure how you call it, but these social cultural tendencies, or I think it's really important because, again, we return remains from families and they may not want them because they're contaminated, the bodies have been contaminated. It's true that there are families or the society or the community will come and sometimes touch the bones, which, maybe to a DNA scientist, it will be, with DNA techniques, it should be manageable, but it's you're not minimizing DNA contamination. And there's also sometimes there are smoking type of rituals or the smoke around. So of course, but we're doing it for the deceased. The main thing is a dignified burial. Whether they've been identified or not, what we are doing is we're recovering them from an unlawful, unethical, burial with little dignity, and reburying them, with a sort of some memory, some more dignity, and so on. And of course, by the next of kin are the ones that have those wounds also that we need to try to heal. I think, just thinking around in circles a bit more now, some of the other things that are important are the objects. What happens to the objects found with the human remains? And to me, as an anthropologist, the objects are so touching. I mean, they carry so many emotions. I'm an objective scientist. I look at bone, human remains. I've looked at many human remains, but actually the objects bring that personality a little bit more, whether it's a razor blade or a wallet with photographs, or some jewelry or something with initials. They really provide emotions. And it's these objects that sometimes are returned to families when available. Okay, not everybody, not every missing person, dead or dead, deceased, has the next of kin still alive. These objects bring a lot of emotions, and it's very important to preserve them properly, restore them if possible. Whether it's in a modern case today, I'm thinking of a fire, for example, or some other incident where you have things being burnt. Sometimes restoring those objects are really important for the next of kin.
Well, do you know what? That's kind of a good segue into why DNA isn't the end all and be all. And because I was reading one of your papers, I'm searching for the missing soldier, and you talk in there about developing, not just seeking DNA, if you have a reference sample and, collecting DNA and what have you, but also developing an osteological profile from any skeletal remains that you have, and then also any objects that you may have, so that you have as many clues as possible to the identity of this individual.
Absolutely. So as you know, to identify someone nowadays positively, you'll need either DNA, fingerprints or ridges, or any other type of, could be from your feet also. So fingerprints, DNA, odontology, so the dental work that you may have, and any unique features. And I'm talking unique sort of surgery, particular implant. And forensic anthropology is trying to push itself, with research into positively identifying people also. But as you know, what we do in forensic anthropology is we create this biological profile. So the age that the person was when he or she died, their height, their biological sex, their ancestral group or population affinity, very controversial topic, and anything else that we can find. If they've got a healed fracture and, issues with mobility, for example. But indeed, forensic anthropology can narrow down that list of missing people. And we shouldn't forget that some forensic anthropologists undertake craniofacial reconstruction, and I'm trying to figure out whether that also helps for First World War, Second World War, and Spanish World War graves. We've got the images of the missing persons, sometimes from families, and to create that facial reconstruction may also help to identify a little bit. What tends to happen is that within the Spanish World War graves, we do have a list of missing people usually, and we do have them sometimes for the First and Second World War. If you think of a B-17 bomber, B-24 bomber crashing into Germany or Sicily, we'll have a passenger manifesto through the historians that are researching these things, these incidents. So we have obviously potential to do DNA, there's relatives and a DNA profile, but otherwise the list of missing people, anthropology may tell you that there's a 50-year-old, when you've got young soldiers, there's a 50-year-old officer. We may have some personal effects. So that can help narrow down that list of missing people. We may not get a positive identification as we tend to use, and the coroner tends to be happy with a positive identification when DNA and odontology is usually present. But it's a probable, tentative identification that is still useful. It's whether we then decide to, how we provide that information to the family members and how we tend to, return those remains, or whether they're kept in a common grave, with their name. So sometimes we can identify everybody, and they may go into a grave with a number of other individuals, but we know their names. I think some scenarios, thinking about DNA today, will just require that that the team has say a DNA hit of this person's, we've identified this person. In other scenarios, every single fragment may be submitted for DNA analysis. And it's very important for anthropologists to actually document that bone. Well, first of all, to identify that bone as human, if it is human, and then submit that for DNA before it's destroyed. Because in some incidents, there's a lot of human remains that may not be sampled. If you say we have 1,000 fragments and there's 10 missing people, and the first 10 fragments come up with the 10 missing people already. So of course, what happens with the rest of those, fragments, and whether that is buried in a common grave or whether they continue to DNA. So there's a lot of that. I just remember that you also asked about some of the questions the families and the relatives ask. I know that for certain humanitarian cases, the context is known. They were taken from home, they were executed and buried. And as anthropologists, we document, as I said, the age at death, stature, biological sex, and so on, anything that is unique to them. And we also document trauma. And although some of these cases are not going to court, they may go to court in the future, so that evidence of trauma is important. But what we're finding is that some of the relatives, apart from now obtaining the remains of their loved ones and after being identified, they actually want to know what really happened. Although they know from testimonies that they were executed and everything, they still want to know exactly, how many bullet holes, gunshot wounds they had, and so on. So actually documenting trauma is quite important for these questions of, what happened really.
And do you release that information to the families? Exactly the trauma you found and therefore what likely had happened?
So when we record trauma, if we think about this case of Spain, and so to go back to Spain, it's the case I work the most. The reports are released, they're online and released to the families. So they want to see the reports, and they want to obviously see the remains. And they do ask, what happened. They never really asked that before many years ago. It was more about identifying the person, and then, but now these questions appear more often now. So yeah, we do release that information. It's the trauma analysis done in the mortuary. The mortuary is screened really from public viewing. We've not really had anyone, it's a different setting altogether from the mass grave. We return the remains, they're buried, and it's usually the reports that they may want to see, but not always.
In your experience, and this may not be now, but maybe in the recent past, have you had any experience with agencies or people, I guess, hesitant or unwilling to release that information on trauma just because they're afraid the families just won't be able to handle it?
Yes. So there's a lot of the human rights cases, a lot of images. So in social media, you can see there's open source images where you see actually the mass grave as well as the trauma. They're everywhere. If you Google, Guatemala Civil War human remains, Spanish Civil War human remains, you'll see so many images on the internet. This is very different to the First and Second World War cases that I've been involved with. On the one hand, there are legislations and policies by the organizations that are dealing with those casualties to not release any images of human remains, whether it's the mass grave or just any images of human remains. This goes back sometimes to, if they're soldiers, to policies and legislation around, not releasing the images of soldiers because of morale and everything. but also because they want, the families to actually get the first word that they found someone. So there are a number of policies against the displaying of images of human remains, but in other conflicts, as I said, they're all over the internet. And I think more than the trauma, the gunshot wound, is even the images of how the bodies are lying in the mass graves that may trigger certain tensions or issues. So I can imagine that a First World War grave, you've got some soldiers with gas masks, face down, sort of thrown in potentially, that has quite a lot of impact, as an image, of how the bodies are, as opposed to just the impact of maybe the gunshot wound. It's different when people may have been executed to the back of the head or have 3 or 4 gunshot wounds to the head. That's quite shocking even for us sometimes. But I think the image of the mass grave itself, or how the bodies are lying, can be more impacting than the trauma analysis as such.
Yeah, there's a lot of emotion involved, and I just, from personal experience, I found that I think the line, there seems to be a line between what information is released and not released, especially as, anthropologists. We can hold a lot of information. We're sort of the knowledge holders, and sometimes we take that position of power for granted. And so when families or next of kin, they're asking for the information. I've heard some anthropologists say, "Do you know what? I'm just going to say, your next of kin died." And when the
Mm-hmm.
family says, "Well, I want to know how," well, where is the burden of responsibility for that, especially when the family is asking for that information? Do we as anthropologists have the right to withhold that information, especially when the families are asking for it? And I just find that there's a lot of it's an emotional gray zone in there.
I'm pro supporting families and trying to meet their needs in the best way possible, as long as it doesn't hinder the investigation, which could be criminal, or the identification of the deceased. I think even today, if you lose someone, the forensic pathologist and the coroner or medical examiner, the families, if they ask, what happened and how that person died, that needs to be released to them. It's really important. It's also important for a number of medical reasons. In forensic anthropology, the family sometimes want to see the remains, and I think that's something to bear in mind also when talking about next of kin, is how you work in the mortuary. I'll give you a few cases. You may have a burnt body, and the easiest thing is probably to dissect the femur, to measure the femur, to estimate stature. But I think, bearing in mind we've got CT scans and X-rays, we can actually minimize the destruction of the body by measuring that bone, on an X-ray. I think it's important because we have to bear in mind that the families may request to view the body, no matter what the state of that body is. And we have to explain what the state of the body is. Sometimes we may want to show some photographs beforehand. But I think when we're processing remains, it's really important to think about the effect of any sampling, any dissection on the relatives. This goes back to many people that may also macerate the body. So they will have a semi-decomposed body, and the easiest thing is maybe to boil the bones and remove them from flesh and everything, which is fine. But sometimes there have been cases where the person has been identified and they're looking at trauma, and the body has been relatively fresh, and the parents want to see the remains of their loved one, and they're skeletonized as opposed to how that person was found. So I think there's a lot of things to think about actually in the post-mortem process. When we go back to explaining what happened, I think it's important. I think obviously there may be a need to have psychologists, and in a number of humanitarian cases, they have some psychologists around the mass grave to deal with the families and ask them those questions. If I was asked this personally, to explain what happened, and bearing in mind that I can obviously getting permission from the judge or the coroner, the police, then I would be obviously very careful. But I would be open to answering as many questions as possible to the relatives. I think I've not really been in that position, I don't think yet, but I will be more pro supporting those families in finding those answers, which is actually sometimes what we're doing, and it's voicing. We provide these voices for those missing people, those dead, and they, the people themselves that died want to maybe even, it's difficult. We need to try to provide as many answers as possible. I understand that it can be hurtful, and I've not been in that situation. But if people want to know and we are able to release that information, then I think we should release that to them.
Yeah, I agree with you. There are things that have been on my mind for quite a long time, and it's nice to be able to talk about them with somebody like you who's very experienced, and who's dealt with these situations or adjacent situations, and you've got a unique point of view.
It's
Yeah.
it's interesting. I mean, I want to hear about what your thoughts were, but it's interesting to also know that from some, probably is hearsay when you think about it, because but I know from some of the environments I've been working with that some of the next of kin don't want to identify themselves with that dead person. I'm talking here about some war casualties, depending on the side they were on, So some of these war casualties, I lost, well, no, my grandparents, fought in the wars and everything for one particular country. But, we've had other nations asking for help, and obviously we would help them. They were soldiers and everything. But I know that for some nations, some of the relatives do not want to provide DNA samples because they don't want to be associated with a certain political party that their, great grandfather or grandfather was in. So that's interesting from the point of view, of also dignity to the deceased, in the sense that they may have fought, for in a different environment, or obliged to fight or something, or forced to fight, and yet there may be no ways to identify that person because it's they fought for a certain political party that wouldn't agree with the relatives that are alive today.
Yeah, those are definitely difficult situations when you're kind of denied access to that information. All you want to do is just identify this individual, but you can't.
What were your thoughts then? What were your thoughts around next of kin yourself? Or I know obviously next of kin can also relate to communities necessarily, not to necessarily the direct next of kin. I'm thinking of some of the indigenous people. I know there's a lot of missing people in Canada now. Don't want to mention too much, but indigenous. But it's also the community, isn't it? That sometimes the communities are the only people that try to also find answers. I know that in the case, again, sorry to go back to Spanish Civil War cases, and it's just because I can relate to some examples, but it's not the children of the missing who are in their 80s or 90s that are trying to find their father, the parents, father or mother. It's actually great grandchildren or grandchildren actually promoting these, these searches. My grandma's generation was very silent about what happened. To be honest, I started working in mass grave excavations from Spain, many years before I learned that my grandmother had lost her father and brother. And I only knew that because I saw a photograph in her house with these other siblings, and I didn't know she had another brother. And then my father told me. And it was frustrating for me that I was, after knowing that story, that I was digging nearby. This becomes quite emotional. And I told my father, can you tell my grandmother that I'm working on searching for victims of the Spanish Civil War? And my father only told her that I was digging a Roman or medieval settlement because they didn't want to break my grandmother's heart. So that's quite an emotional thing, So what I'm saying is this silence sometimes from the direct children, not always, and it's the sort of generations removed away that is actually pushing for these things to happen. I was in Bosnia and Herzegovina in last year, and I spoke to some of these associations that obviously search for the missing, and some of them are brothers of those missing people. And you can see them in Latin America. It's the mothers or parents that are searching for their children. And I see some of the efforts that they're putting into this. And I was thinking, they just need some. Well, actually, it's a double-edged sword, because you can have the family searching for the missing, which means that the authorities are not doing anything, or the families do not search, requesting the authorities to search. But I was looking at the way people were searching, and I was thinking, if we could just tell them something about how to do a systematic search, it would make them more cost effective in that way. But again, you're training people that shouldn't really be doing the work. It should be the authorities. And actually, some things that relates to next of kin that has happened to me is that, and it happens sometimes with some of these cases where there hasn't been much training or capacity building, or authorities haven't been involved, where it's down to relatives to find, where they lose information if they're not trained in forensic archaeology and anthropology. I've had comments, mainly because some of these scenarios that I work with are politically charged sometimes, and I try to stay away from the political aspect, try to be objective as we are, and scientific and neutral. But obviously the anger is that this should have been done many, many years ago, decades ago. But what I am trying to tell them is that if this was done decades ago, you may not have the identifications that you have now. We have new techniques, we have new methods, science is advancing. If you exhumed, remains in the 1980s, as some of the in some countries they were doing, we didn't have the DNA analysis that we do nowadays. We don't have the geophysical methods that we're used to search. So it is coming late, but it's also coming at the right time, where we have the science to be able to maximize the identification of the deceased, and also the recovery of evidence that may lead to prosecution later on. Which is an important point, because this person was saying this shouldn't happen. We're in the year 2022 or 2021. It should have happened decades ago. And I was trying to say it's definitely yes, but I want to give you that peace of mind that now we've got the techniques that can provide identification that you did not have decades ago.
It's tough because I too look at situations where the authorities either can't or won't do a search or proper recovery because they lack the motivation, they lack the funding, they lack the manpower for whatever reasons. And so they can't do a proper search, or they're not trained so that they're missing stuff. And then either the evidence isn't analyzed properly because, again, they lack the training, they lack the awareness, they lack the technology. They don't know. But I think it's important to, and I guess that's one of the reasons why I'm doing this podcast. It's important to be aware of what you could possibly not know. And so when you're aware of what you could possibly not know, at least then, like some law enforcement did back in the 80s, they didn't have DNA analysis, or not the point that we have it now, but yet they kept the samples so that at one point in the future, they hoped that we would have the technology, and lo and behold, we now do. So they at least knew what they possibly didn't know. And I think the danger is when the authorities and the public just don't know what they possibly don't know. It's a double-edged sword.
Yes, double-edged sword also happens with crime now, doesn't it? And in terms of these forensic science programs, about what technology can do and things like that. But you're absolutely right. A lot of the cold cases have been resolved because we have samples that were collected many years ago. And I think the important thing now is that in terms of promoting forensic archaeology and forensic anthropology, is that identification isn't at the laboratory. Okay, identification starts well before the scene. It's when you gather all the information about the deceased. But what's important, and especially when you've got many individuals in a mass grave, is that the forensic archaeology, that documentation about whether this object goes with a skeleton A or individual A, skeleton B or individual B. Obviously, they will have names eventually, but identifying, documenting what object goes with which human remains is so important, because that's when you start the identification process. Also, these personal effects that come into being. And if you don't use forensic archaeology or forensic anthropology, then you are losing a lot of information to help identify those people. You may not be recording things accurately enough. There may be evidence that is mixed, evidence that cannot be associated to certain human remains. So it's really important to see that we play a role, even to the point, as I said earlier on, where the forensic anthropologist can find something that is bone that may be mistaken by a stone, and identify that bone is actually human as opposed to animal. So we have a big role to play in many cases today.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of my biggest arguments with research, with doing research and proposing research on scattered and scavenged remains, that it goes right back to the beginning when you're actually searching for the remains, that if your searchers are untrained and they think we're just here to search for remains, or they think they know what the remains look like, then they may be discounting a whole bunch of potential evidence and they don't even know. So you're losing out all that information. And that can be very damaging to, whatever investigation you're working on.
Absolutely. I saw a presentation once by a colleague in the US, and he presented a case without the contextual information, without the use of forensic archaeology, and the case when you would have that information and the amount of information you can gain with the appropriate methods. Forensic archaeology, anthropology is so important at the scene. And your comment reminds me of one case that I can finish off really in a way, which is it's the first time I've been asked by the police how many bones are missing. As you know, when we recover the remains, we do an inventory of the skeleton or the human remains that are present. We do an inventory, and then we list the bones that are missing for a number of reasons. We list the bones that are missing so we can inform the search parties to look for those bones. We can, if bones have been found previously, we can potentially match them to what we found now, or if they're found in the future, we know what's missing from the current case. But is that when I write the inventory, the bones that are present or the bones that are missing in my expert witness statement or report, I did have the question by a police officer saying the family are asking what bones are missing. This was a case where a body was going to be repatriated to a different country. And I realized in that case, it was just a number of hand bones or phalanges. They were scavenging actually, and we could explain why and so on. But it wasn't the skull. I'm sure if it was the skull or, an upper limb or a lower limb, that would be a bit more, not meaningful, but it would have more of an impact, for the family. So I think just having that information about what bones are missing, it made me realize that actually the families are also asking that, because they want to know what is in that coffin and what remains are going to be buried. And, they want to visualize perhaps, and again, it goes back to recovering as much as possible to be able to provide as much for the families in terms of the remains. And this happens with mass disasters, where you may have a fragment that has a DNA profile that can be identified to a person, but can you actually, with forensic anthropology, can you actually glue that fragment or match that fragment with other fragments, and be able to provide the families with as many remains or human remains or bones of their loved ones back for burial.
Absolutely. Yeah. And again, that can, tie back into what we were talking about before. It's not just about answering the family's questions, but if they have any mortuary or ceremonial or, emotional reasons for the closure, and, having those remains in as a complete way as possible, or whether they need to do ceremony with the remains, or whether having a complete set means more to them, or what have you. There's all sorts of different reasons for
And
addressing. Yeah.
we continue talking, Yvonne, because I'm thinking now Cambodia. You have, certainly the bones are there exposed. There are families that know that these may be, and it's just sort of looking at that sort of perception. You wonder what the families think about the bones being there, and on display in a way. And there's a lot of things about closure that we said. We've got missing at sea from wars that can't be recovered. There may be monuments. There's all these different things that are of interest, and obviously it would spark a lot of conversations and debates. But yeah, it's mainly about dignity, isn't it? And helping the deceased for a dignified burial, recover them, and closure for families.
Well, we can talk for hours, Nick.
It seems like it.
But I'm gonna we're coming up on. I'm just conscious of the time here. So, is there anything that you want to touch on before we close out that maybe we haven't touched on that you want to address?
No, I think the only thing that I'm trying to work now is providing some artwork to help families sort of understand this process of investigation. So I've got, and also for children, to perhaps inspire someone. So have someone who's writing a book for children on the process of forensic archaeology and anthropology. And the
Very
reason is,
cool.
and the reason is that there's a lot of children today in schools that come from conflicts and they're missing relatives and so on. And these sort of books, may I don't know if it empathize a little bit, but it also helps to maybe inspire someone, in those schools to become a forensic archaeologist, anthropologist, go back to their countries and do this. But also it provides lessons that everybody can help in these cases. So no matter, you don't have to be a forensic scientist. You could be someone that speaks a language that helps you, someone that is good at logistics, someone that can, help you with building something. So there's always a place for everybody, no matter what you do. Whether any profession has a place in searching for missing people, and these things should also help children to understand that these things shouldn't happen again. So I have this writer who writes children's books. I have someone working on a graphic novel, because I've learned a lot for graphic novels. I mean, it started with some from the Spanish Civil War. I bought some on the First and Second World War, and I learned so much about history. And I think it's so accessible. And then I have some infographics, so a visual artist helping to understand, when we're digging a mass grave, provide that information for families, and perhaps create some workshops for them. So yeah, there's a lot of also art involved in the missing people. We've had art as therapy. There's a group called Conflict Textiles which works with the communities, and they try to, with clothing from the missing person or just through textiles, they don't want text, they just want an image to present, if there's been torture or a mass grave or something. So there's a lot of art representations that help push governments to open mass graves, or when mass graves are opened, there's a lot of art coming out in terms of healing and treatment. But that's another story altogether.
That's amazing. If when any of that is ready, please pay it forward.
Okay.
I would love to see that. And wow, that's great
Brilliant.
stuff, Nick. Yeah.
Okay. That's the one. It's been really inspiring. I mean, speaking to you, it's just brought all of these things out. And I never had a lecture or an interview or a talk about next of kin. It's actually having this opportunity with you has actually brought all of these things out and ideas and has put it all nicely into one. So I'm really grateful, to be honest, because it
Nice.
wasn't an invitation I was expecting. You know, it's away from the science in a way. It's the human part of what we do and the emotional part. And I'm really grateful because you've brought a lot of things out. I don't know if I would say it's therapy for me, but it certainly helped me with a lot of things and looking forward in terms of, you know, the future work that we're doing. So thanks very much for bringing up this topic.
Thank you for answering my call.
I hope you've enjoyed listening to this episode. Please leave a rating or review and share this episode and podcast with your friends, family, and colleagues.